Well, good day there. This is Joe Van Cleve. Welcome to the results from typing assignment number 3. This assignment was writing a one-pager about youthful hangouts. What were some of the places you used to commonly hang out as a young person? Who were the people you met? What were some of the things that might have happened? So every one of us has I'm sure, an experience of notable record in our memory about youthful hangouts, some of the special places. And so it's obviously a wealth, a trove of wealth for stories and possibilities. And so I was very anxious to see what were some of the things that you guys came up with, and I was not disappointed. We had some great results here, and so I'm anxious to share them with you today. So before we get into the slideshow of all of the pieces, I was just going to say that it was interesting results, and I noted in pertaining to the various typewriters that people use that we had, I think, 3 Olympias of various models and represented in here. And also, interestingly enough, we had 3 Royal Quiet Deluxes. So apparently Royal Quiet Deluxes are the favored typewriter model of you guys, which I find very interesting. Very few issues, really no issues at all that I had pertaining to getting the typed pieces inputted to my system here. You guys did great posting them online. I didn't have any issues at all. Hopefully you guys were okay with it also, the process. So we're going to continue with the same way that we did it last time. I'm going to do a slideshow accompanied by some kind of, quote, music, unquote. You're free to mute the sound if it bothers you, and you guys can read through them as they scan, and then afterwards I'm going to give my impressions of the work that was submitted. Okay, without any further ado, here we go. I really look forward to this process of getting all of the titles and the pieces arranged in a little document, and then reading through all of your pieces and writing down my little notes about what my impressions were. I really love that. It's a great blessing for me. I have the pleasure of doing this, reading this fresh creativity. So starting out with John Monroe's piece, Hanging Out at the Res, typed on a 1958 Olympia SM2. You know, I thought at first, of course, I live in New Mexico, and so I was initially thinking of the reservation, Native American reservations, but of course he references that, but the res he was talking about is the reservoir. His story was really great. I like the line he has in here, "The one thing I seldom got was a little peace and quiet." And he's talking about large families, living in a large family and being surrounded by large families. And I really like what he talks about, the wooded outdoors that they used to play in. And in fact, this was a common theme throughout all of these stories I found. Not every one, but a large majority of them. The people are probably, you guys are probably similar to my age. I was born in the late 50s. And so we might have grown up when our country was not quite as overbuilt, and things were a little bit more rural maybe and undeveloped. And we lived right in that time when things were first being developed, as similar to the way they are today. So a lot of references here to what it was like playing in the outdoors. And I really contrast this with the way parenting is in this era, where parents seem to be almost overprotective of their kids. Children aren't allowed to play outside. You just can't go out and ride your bike down to some woods, because nowadays we're all afraid of the serial killers and the rapists and the child molesters, probably for good reason. But it's just a sad commentary on the state of things as they are today. But we can certainly enjoy reading about what it was like when we could play with large groups of families and kids in the outdoors. Really loved his piece, Hanging Out at the Res. Richard Wood's piece, My Childhood Retreat, typed on a 1963 Adler Tippa. I like his line, "These were the best of times, completely naive of the world to come." And he says, but we were good kids. And I love the idea of, again, similar to John's, spending hours and hours outdoors, unescorted by adults, free and safe to explore the world and in your own creativity. Wonderful memories, and I really think that these are troves of treasure to be further mined. And if you guys have any inkling to do so, I would encourage you to keep working at expanding on these memories into something greater. But great job. And the third piece was Andrew Nichols' Delinquenicity, and it was typed on a 1950s Hermes baby rocket. And I like the piece about the little red car that he had. He says, and it is thanks to that little red car, a country lane, Bowie, referring to David Bowie, and my best mate. And it really reminds me of the importance of having really good friends in those first formative years as a young adult. I was really impressed with this sense of youthful optimism, because if you get to be kind of a middle-aged person, sometimes you lose your optimism about the future. And I liked the naivete and the innocence of his younger self and his friends, and how he expressed it. And also there's a bit of sadness that we've all experienced, I think, how friends, even as close as they were, his best mate, and those experiences they had together, how friends tend to drift apart over time just because of the responsibilities of life. And I can certainly relate to that. And you know, as you get older, it seems like you have fewer and fewer real friends. So I really loved his piece, and it just brings up so many memories of my own. So Andy Kev's piece, Youthful Hangouts, typed on an Olympia SG1. And I liked this. This is great, how his young experience as wanting to get his pilot's license and the importance of working hard toward that goal changed the direction of his life, really. He says to sprout wings and fly. And it was about his parents allowing him to get his pilot's license. And in order to do that, he had to get a job and work at it consistently and earn money to get his driver's license, and then get a car so he can go to the airport and then afford to take pilot's license. So one step after the other. It was great to see what he did as a young person to work toward a goal. It also brought to mind the importance of adult teacher mentors. I had several teacher mentors in my life, and they are so important, and we should never forget the importance of that even today. There's young people that might need us as mentors. And then I was also impressed by this thing of hanging on to your youthful interests, even throughout your life. Today, the airport is still his favorite hangout. And I think that's true. A lot of your formative experiences tend to influence you throughout the rest of your life. And that was reflected again and again throughout these pieces. So great job. David Randall's piece called Hanging Out, typed on a 1940 Royal Quiet Deluxe. And he says nowadays his favorite place to hang out is at home with his wife and cat. But I love this idea in his story that bicycles were a child's vehicle of freedom. And I can so relate to that. In my teenage years, a bicycle or on foot was my only way around town, and it was a vehicle of freedom. And I love this idea of youthful camaraderie that created in him a lifelong love of social groups and clubs later on. And again, this is reinforcing this whole idea of what influences us as children really is a great director of how we are later in life. And Diane C., her story, Books and Ice Cream. And I love this, the idea of bookstores as hangouts, because I had a bookstore. It was Book World, just down a half-mile down from where I live now. Book World's no longer there, but yeah, bookstores as hangouts. I spent so much time in bookstores myself. The smell of musty books she talks about. And I like her line, the finishing line of the piece, "Those were the days, my friend." Indeed they are. I can certainly relate to being a bookworm and hanging out there. I love that piece. So David Wells is In the Margin, typed on an Olympia SM8. Oh, did I mention that Diane C.'s piece was typed on a Hermes 3000? Sorry about that. So David Wells, In the Margins, Olympia SM8. Here's a great line. He says, "It wasn't the place that made it special. It was who we were and what we did that made it great." Now, isn't that a great line? And then he says, "I often look to the woods that border the highways I travel." He's talking about these places of marginalia. You might call them interstitials between the backyards of housing subdivisions and the freeway, the highway. And how these interstitials were never intended to be parks or to be places of finding recreation. But somehow the creativity of youth finds a way to work your way into these interstitial areas and make them magical places all for yourself. And he does a great job of describing all the wonderfully magical and creative things that they did as kids in these places. And it created in him this lifelong love for the hidden wonders. And again, every time he drives the highways and he sees these places off the edge of the highway, it reminds him of his young days in those kind of places. And so I'm also reminded, though, how there's a contrast between this youthful adventure that we find ourselves doing as kids and the adult responsibilities and the boring routines of being a grown-up. And you kind of wonder, where did the magic go? Why do we allow ourselves to be dragged down into the routine of adulthood? Why can't we live continually with that sense of youthful adventure, making adventure out of everything we do? Yeah, that's what it reminds me of, and great job, David. It really brought up a lot of feelings there. Darren Sundstrom's piece, Youthful Hangouts, typed on a Smith Corona Silent Super. Here's a great line: "Youthful sentinels of a world in transition." Isn't that great? And he says, "Our own self-contained cosmos," talking about these places that we would hang out at. It really were. They were a little world, a little universe unto themselves. He talks about the power of imagination and unhindered youthful play, how important that is. And especially in his situation, it was these construction sites and fallow lands, former farmers' fields and orchards that were the hunting grounds for adventure. And they used them as role-playing games, staging areas for role-playing games. And I really think what's interesting about this is these were all transitional scenes. In other words, building sites where new houses were being built, that was a transitional thing. That only lasted a short period of time, and yet the youthfulness and imagination of childhood is able to find a way to use them for their own adventure that will last them for the rest of their life. If he was to go back here today to that same area, there's probably very little or no remnants left of any of that. It's all built up. And yet it was just a short transitional period of time that they took advantage of and made it their own little world. So great recounting of that, Darren. Thank you. John Campbell's piece that is not titled, but it begins "In the Younger Days," which I love. He typed it on a 3-bank Underwood portable. I really liked the odd characters and the regulars who would hang out at this Larry's restaurant, the cafe. Because it reminds me so much of some of the people that I met and knew as a youngster. And these adult characters that we meet as young people make such a strong impression of us later in life, and that is so true. And I also like the idea of restaurants as hangouts, because I didn't hang out at restaurants that often, but there were a few places that I would frequent, and they are kind of interesting. They almost have the feeling of a bar in a sense of the characters that hang out at bars and taverns. I liked his idea of the milkshakes as his favorite menu item, but especially it was just the interesting clientele, the characters. There's so much more to be done with those characters, and I hope you work at that. It would really be great to read more of this. David sees so many quarters, typed on an Adler, 1970s Adler Contessa Deluxe. I like this process that he describes of working jobs as a young person to earn money so you can play games, put quarters in the machines at the arcade, and hang out with friends. And he mentions specifically the idea of no cell phones. You don't see kids absorbed in their little screens. And he contrasts this with nowadays, this is kind of gravitated to, instead of being in a physical arcade with other people socially, it's virtual online game playing. I also like the naivete of having this kids' game room adjoining a liquor store. And you can imagine in today's society, they probably wouldn't do that. But it was a more naive time. I really enjoyed it. Michael Kitchen's piece, "Leave the Driving to Us," typed on a 1951 Royal Quiet Deluxe. Again, another Quiet Deluxe. Yeah, this was great. I love this description of the bus station as a hangout that becomes his workplace. And I like this idea of youthful activities that become lifelong interests, like the comic books and the zines and the writing. And it's also a great story of being robbed at gunpoint. You know, it could have gone a lot worse. What a great story. And I like your opening sentence. "The place I used to hang out at was also the only place that I have ever been on the wrong side of a gun." That gripped me right from the start. That was a great opening line. Yeah, bus stops. There's a lot of fertile ground there, bus stations, for more writing there. Michael Rasmussen's "On the Edge of the Future," typed on a 1958 Optima Elite 3. I liked his line, "The American dream of the 60s was arriving. For a half-dozen years, our private places were the open spaces of a disappearing land, places that live on as the foundations of our character." Man, that distills the essence of so much of what I read in these stories today. That, first of all, these were indicative of a disappearing land. The land that we used to know as open spaces is no longer open. And more so, if there are any open spaces left, they're fenced off and no trespassers are allowed in. But it showed me the importance of these temporal transition zones that only last for a brief period of time. And it seems like in between the constant change of our civilization, as kids, we seem to be able to find room for play and adventure. You know, you give a kid a dirt field and some sticks and rocks, and he can do so much with that, with his imagination. It also reminds me, though, that how much our land and our landscape is changing before our very eyes. When you can reflect back on these things that we grew up with that are no longer there, and you think about, what are the youth of today, what are they facing? Huh? Kind of a sobering thought, but great piece. Thank you. John M's The Dream Cottage, typed on a 1935 L.C. Smith Corona Standard. He says, did I mention we were a family of 8? Yeah, and this story is really powerful, because this is the story about the value of hard times and scraping by and making do, of harsh winters and living in a barely adequate, or really less than adequate, housing. And then later on in life, he says, I can only imagine if it was still ours. And you know what? That reminds me of, I can go downtown Albuquerque and I can find my grandparents' house. The building is still there. And you know what? It doesn't belong to the family anymore. It's actually a lawyer's office. And I think to myself, that used to be ours, and it's no longer ours. But what they can't take away from me are the memories. I still own the memories. And John, you did a great job of recounting them for us. Thank you. Kevin Kay's story, Hot Ditch, typed on a 1933 Underwood 4-bank portable. What a great story. He says, we came to this outdoor cathedral to search for an epiphany of our future. Wow. This was a wonderful story. It is being conscious of how brief and valuable are these few transitional teen years before the onset of full adulthood. And it is the fact that as young kids, they were conscious of how valuable these short few years were. And they wanted to experience the most of it and have experiences that they would never forget. It's the value of hidden, out-of-the-way places. This is a theme that seems to have reoccurred over and over again in these stories. And their new purpose, repurposing these out-of-the-way places that aren't really found on any map. You couldn't go down to the city or the county and find this lot and have it listed, this is a place where people have adventures. No, this was just a interstitial area as far as the official government was concerned. But kids find a way of repurposing civilization's infrastructure for their own creativity. Diane M's Youthful Hangouts on the 1954 Royal Quiet Deluxe, again. This was a great story. I like the Galaxy pizza sign found later on in life on the day they were driving to the 25th anniversary of their high school reunion. There's this Galaxy pizza sign they see on the side of the road. The next day, it disappears. Wow, that was powerful. That was like a harbinger, right? An omen, if you will. But it really reminds me of the temporary nature of these strip mall businesses. You know, there are so many of these strip mall businesses in my town, and you'll see some business that's there for a few years and then it disappears. And there's a whole continual turnover and a life cycle of these places coming and going. They rise and they slowly decline. And you kind of wonder, her story kind of implies, who were the owners of these places? Like in her case, the Galaxy Pizza that started out, got big, and then it slowly faded off and ended up being a place where druggies hung out at before it closed. You wonder who the owners were, what their story was, what might have happened with them. Great idea, great writing, Diane. I loved it. And then Preston English's, I'm not going to, his piece that the first line of which is, I'm not going to lie. I'm not the happiest to speak of this. Wow, it's a powerful opening line. He's typed it on a Smith Corona Enterprise too. And there's a lot of unspoken implied things in this story. And the story really kind of doesn't really unfold itself on this one page. It really needs much more. And he references his website to continue reading about it. But it's really a powerful opening to some deep things that happened early on in his life in this place. And that is so powerful. And all of these pieces, but especially Preston's, kind of reminds me how youthful experiences are some of our most powerful. And we see throughout, for instance, 20th century literature, how much youthful influences are used in storytelling. You know, you can imagine, think about what The Catcher in the Rye, right, Holden Caulfield. But there's a lesser known book that I might draw your attention to, and it's called The Stones of Summer. The Stones of Summer. And I think it's best to get into The Stones of Summer if you go look for the documentary. There's a documentary called The Stones of Summer. You'll probably find it on Amazon or Netflix or whatever. Go and watch it. It's about this guy that wanted to be a writer, and he worked at it for years in obscurity, finally had it published, and disappeared, never wrote anything else. And this guy unearthed it years later, and the documentary is about him trying to find out what happened with this guy that wrote The Stones of Summer, and he wants to discover where the author is and what happened to him in subsequent years. So all of your pieces collectively combined reminds me of how powerful our youthful experiences are. It reminds me of The Stones of Summer. And so you guys did a great job. And I was even thinking I probably should have participated myself and done a story, because I had a lot to relate to in my life, to a lot of the things that you guys wrote here. And maybe at a future assignment I'll include myself in it. But great job. I was very impressed, and it brought up a lot of deep memories of my own childhood growing up. And so look forward to, in the next day or so, typing assignment number 4. But until next time, this is Joe Van Cleve, and happy creating.